Leo's morning began with a ritual of quiet precision. He aligned the pen on his notebook until it was perfectly parallel to the desk's edge. He wiped a single invisible speck of dust from his monitor. His apartment was immaculate, a gallery of order and control. Every surface gleamed, every book stood at attention. But the air in the room was still and heavy. It was the silence of a held breath. On his screen, a single, blank document glowed. The cursor pulsed, a tiny, relentless metronome counting the seconds he was not writing. This was his project. The one he had dreamed of for years. And for months, he had been preparing to start. He had researched, outlined, color-coded his notes. He had created the perfect environment. But the first sentence remained unwritten. The pressure was a physical weight on his chest, a tightness that made each breath feel shallow. Starting meant the possibility of imperfection, and that felt more terrifying than any failure. The email notification chimed, a sharp sound in the quiet. It was from his editor. Leo's heart skipped, a jolt of adrenaline. He opened it, his hands tense. The message was brief. The deadline had been extended by 2 weeks. A colleague's project had run long, pushing the entire schedule back. For a single soaring moment, relief washed over him. More time, he could breathe. The tightness in his chest loosened its grip. But as quickly as it came, the relief vanished, replaced by a deeper, colder dread. 2 more weeks. That wasn't more time to do good work. It was more time for the work to be perfect. The expectations, which were entirely his own, had just been raised impossibly higher. The weight returned, heavier than before. It wasn't a reprieve, it was a sentence. He pushed back from the desk, the chair rolling silently on the polished floor. He stood and walked to the window, looking down at the city moving below. Everyone else was in motion, engaged, doing. He was trapped in the pristine stillness of his own making. The project was no longer a creative endeavor. It was a monument he had to build without a single flaw. The thought was paralyzing. He returned to his computer, but not to the blank document. He opened a browser tab. He would do more research, just a little more. He needed to find one more source, one more angle, to ensure the foundation was absolutely sound. It was a familiar dance, this delaying, masquerading as preparation. The tightening in his chest was his constant companion, a reminder that perfect was still out of reach, and starting was the one step he could not afford to get wrong. A knock at the door broke his concentration. It was soft, hesitant. Leo froze. He wasn't expecting anyone. The sound was an intrusion into his carefully controlled silence. He considered ignoring it, but the knocking came again, a little louder. He opened the door to find his neighbor, Maya. She stood there with a small, apologetic smile, her hands dusted with flour. A smudge of it was on her cheek. "Leo, hi! I am so sorry to bother you. I'm in the middle of baking a cake, and I've run out of eggs. Do you happen to have one I could borrow?" Leo looked from her warm, slightly flustered face to her hands. They were a mess. The flour was under her nails, caked in the lines of her knuckles. He glanced back into his own apartment, a scene of sterile order, and felt a strange pang of embarrassment. "Of course," he said, his voice sounding too quiet in the hallway. "Just 1 second." He went to his refrigerator, which was as meticulously organized as the rest of his life, and retrieved a single egg. He held it out to her carefully. "You're a lifesaver," Maya said, taking the egg. Her fingers, warm and alive, brushed against his. "Thank you. I'm trying a new recipe, and it's a complete disaster so far. The batter's way too thick. But hey, it's all part of the fun, right?" She laughed, a light, easy sound that seemed to push back the heavy air in the hallway. Leo managed a small smile. "A disaster." She said the word so casually, as if it were a minor inconvenience, not a catastrophic failure. "I'm sure it will be fine," he said, the words feeling hollow. "Oh, it'll be edible, which is the main thing," she replied with a shrug. "Well, thanks again. Don't work too hard." She turned and walked back to her apartment, leaving Leo standing in his doorway. He could hear faint music playing from her home, and the clatter of a bowl. Life, messy and ongoing. He closed his door softly. The silence of his apartment rushed back in, but it felt different now. It felt empty, not peaceful. The image of Maya's flour-dusted hands, so comfortable with their imperfection, lingered in his mind. It was a small crack in the wall of pressure he had built around himself. For a moment he had connected with someone who was not waiting for perfect. She was already in the middle of making something. Leo closed the door and leaned against it, the cool wood a solid presence against his back. He looked across the room at his desk. The monitor still glowed, the blank document, a silent accusation. But the feeling was different now. The image of Maya, so at ease in her messy, creative process, had shifted something inside him. The pressure was still there, the tightness in his chest, a familiar companion, but it no longer felt like the only truth. He walked slowly back to his chair. He didn't sit down immediately. He stood behind it, his hands resting on the backrest, and looked at the screen. He remembered Maya's words. It's a complete disaster so far. But hey, it's all part of the fun, right? Fun. The concept was foreign to this project. It had become a trial, an ordeal to be survived. An internal battle began, silent and fierce. One voice, the one he knew so well, insisted on more preparation. Just read one more article. Refine the outline one more time. You can't start until you're absolutely ready. The first sentence has to be perfect. The voice was logical, seductive in its promise of safety. Starting imperfectly felt like stepping off a cliff. But another voice, a quieter, newer one, whispered a different message. It didn't argue with the first voice. It simply offered an alternative. What if you didn't have to write a perfect sentence? What if you just wrote a terrible one? The idea was so absurd, so contrary to everything he believed, that it almost made him laugh. A terrible sentence. The thought was terrifying, but it was also, strangely, a relief. It lowered the stakes from impossible to merely difficult. The battle raged for what felt like an hour but was only a few minutes. He felt the tension in his shoulders, the familiar urge to procrastinate, to clean something, to do anything but this. But he kept looking at the screen. He kept hearing Maya's easy laugh. He made a choice. It wasn't a grand, dramatic decision. It was a small, stubborn act of defiance against the tyranny of perfect. He would write one sentence, and he would give himself permission for it to be the worst sentence ever written. He would not edit it, he would not delete it. He would simply type it and leave it there, a testament to having begun. He sat down. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, trembling slightly. The blank page seemed to expand, to threaten to swallow him. He took a slow, deep breath, feeling the tightness in his chest. Then he exhaled, and as he did, he forced his fingers to move. He typed a single, clumsy, awkward sentence. It was a simple statement of fact, devoid of style or grace. He read it back. It was, as promised, terrible. But it was there. The page was no longer blank. The dam had a crack. He stared at the sentence. It sat alone on the vast white landscape of the document, a small, imperfect thing. The voice in his head immediately screamed for deletion. You can't leave that there! It's awful! Start over! But Leo remembered his promise. He had given himself permission for this. He would not go back. Instead of deleting it, he did something else. He placed the cursor at the end of the sentence and hit the period key again, then pressed Enter twice, creating a new paragraph. The terrible sentence was now part of the past. The new blank space beneath it felt different. It wasn't the terrifying void of the beginning, it was simply the next step. The sentence, for all its flaws, had asked a question. It had created a need for a second sentence to explain it, to build upon it. Almost without thinking, he began to type the second sentence. It wasn't much better than the first. It was clunky and vague. But it was a companion to the first. Then a third sentence came, and this one was slightly clearer. He was no longer trying to write the great American novel in a single phrase. He was just trying to explain the clumsy thought he had already put down. He was building, word by word. A strange thing began to happen. The tightness in his chest, which had been a constant pressure for weeks, began to loosen. It didn't vanish, but it softened, like a clenched fist, slowly opening. The frantic, panicked energy that usually accompanied his writing attempts began to settle into a slower, steadier rhythm. He was no longer fighting against the work, trying to force it into a perfect shape from the start. He was following it, seeing where it would go. He discovered a flow in the imperfection. Because he had allowed himself to be bad, he was no longer paralyzed by the fear of being bad. The sentences began to link together, forming paragraphs. Ideas that had been tangled knots in his outline began to unravel onto the page in a simple, linear fashion. He wasn't crafting a masterpiece. He was having a conversation with the page. He would write a thought, and the page would ask for the next logical thought. An hour passed. He didn't notice. The world outside his window darkened as evening fell, but he didn't turn on a lamp. The glow from the monitor was enough. He looked up from the screen and realized he had written 3 full pages. They were raw and unpolished. There were clumsy phrases and repetitive words, but they were complete. They formed a coherent, if rough, beginning. The feeling was not one of triumph, but of quiet, profound relief. It was the feeling of a weight being lifted from his shoulders, a weight he had been carrying for so long he had forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. He had aimed for complete, and he had achieved it. The goal of perfect had been the obstacle all along. It was the fear of the imperfect first step that had kept him frozen. But once he took that step, however wobbly, the path began to appear under his feet. The joy was not in the quality of the words, but in the simple, undeniable fact that they existed at all. He had created something. He leaned back in his chair, his spine cracking softly after hours of stillness. The 3 pages on the screen were a messy, sprawling thing. Sentences trailed off. Ideas were repeated. But it was a whole. He looked at it not with the critical eye of a judge, but with the quiet satisfaction of a builder who has finally raised the frame of a house. The walls might be rough, but they were up. The shape was there. He stood and walked away from the desk, leaving the document open. He went to the kitchen and poured a glass of water. As he drank, his eyes scanned the living room. The perfect alignment of the pen on the notebook now seemed absurd, a pointless ritual of control. The sterile cleanliness of the space felt cold, not peaceful. The project was no longer a distant, terrifying monument. It was a thing he had begun. The obstacle had not been the work itself, but the idea of the work he had built in his head. With a new, strange sense of freedom, he deliberately left his water glass on the coffee table, a small rebellion against his own rules. He decided to make dinner. But instead of following a complex recipe that required perfect technique, he boiled some pasta and tossed it with olive oil and herbs. It was simple. It was enough. As he ate, he felt the last of the tightness in his chest dissolve. The weight was gone. In its place was a light, steady feeling of movement. He had shifted from preparing to live to actually living. The transformation was not in the quality of his draft, but in the quality of his breath. He was no longer holding it. The next morning he did not rush to his desk. He made coffee and took his time. When he finally sat down, he read through the 3 pages. He made edits, but they were improvements, not desperate attempts at perfection. He smoothed out the clumsy sentences. He clarified the vague ideas. The work felt like collaboration now, a conversation between himself and the words already on the page. He worked for a few more hours, and the draft grew to 5 pages. It was better. It was still imperfect. And that was fine. The submission deadline arrived. In the past, this moment would have been a crisis. He would have frantically scanned the document for one last error, one final phrase to polish. Today he felt only a deep, calm certainty. He read the introduction one last time. It was clear. It was honest. It was complete. He attached the file to an email, wrote a brief note to his editor, and clicked send. The feeling that followed was not the euphoria of achievement, but the profound relief of release. It was the sensation of putting down a heavy bag after a long journey. He had not created a perfect thing. He had created a real thing. And in doing so, he had grown. He understood now that growth doesn't happen in the planning. It happens in the doing, in the small steady steps forward, in the willingness to be imperfect along the way. His new measure of success was not a flawless final product, but the act of completion itself. The goal was no longer perfect. The goal was to finish, to learn, and to begin again. Leo stood at the window, watching the city lights blink on in the twilight. He took a slow, deep breath, feeling the air fill his lungs completely, without resistance. The imperfect, vibrant cityscape was far more beautiful than any sterile, imagined perfection. If this story resonates with you, I encourage you to take one small, imperfect step today. Share in the comments one thing you will begin. Not perfectly, but completely. Your journey starts with that first sentence.